the garden. And now we come to the curses on the serpent, on the woman, and on the man Adam. And for today, we're only going to look at verses 14 and 15. So let's just start by reading those two verses. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." Now, this is going to take some really nuanced exposition, especially verse 15 in particular. These are the texts that I get warned about putting everybody to sleep in. But if you hang in there with me, especially next week, Lord willing, you will learn about one of the most profound theological texts in all of the Bible. But today we're going to just focus in particular upon this curse on the serpent. And let me start by giving you an illustration that Dr. Erwin Lutzer gave in his book entitled The Serpent of Paradise. He writes this: "There was a construction company that invited various contractors to submit bids for a major building complex. All things being equal, the contractor who submitted the lowest bid would get the job. The bids had to be submitted in secret. On the last day the bids could be tendered, a contractor walked into the office of the president of the company with a bid application in his hand. To his surprise, the office of the president was empty, and he stood alone, venturing a glance at the huge mahogany desk in front of him. Much to his surprise, he saw on the desk the bid of his major competitor lying there. The only problem was there was a can of soda pop sitting directly over the most important figure in the document, the final bid. If this contractor knew the amount that was written on that line, he could adjust his own bid and come in just beneath it, and the multi-million-dollar job would be his. The contractor nervously paced the floor, knowing full well what was at stake. He contemplated moving the can just for a second, reading the figure and putting it back. He touched the can, but found himself unable to do that. He glanced around the room one more time, now confident that no one was looking. He lifted the can quickly, intently glanced at the number, and put the can back instantly, but much to his chagrin. As he lifted the can from the desk, hundreds of BBs spilled out onto the desk and rolled all out over the floor. This was a setup. That contractor experienced the law of unintended consequences. He thought he could control the fallout of his dishonesty, but discovered that unforsaken events had been built into the temptation at hand. One single act had repercussions that he could not have anticipated. And that, folks, is exactly what happened to Satan when he felt the law of unintended consequences at his own rebellion against God. And that's exactly what happened to Adam and Eve when they set into motion, literally a spiritual avalanche as a result of their sin. And they too experienced the law of unintended consequences. Lucifer had no idea what would be set in motion when he rebelled in heaven, and neither did Adam and Eve when they ate the forbidden fruit. The ultimate impact of that temptation now comes in the form of a curse. And let me make this point before we go any further. There are natural consequences that everyone faces for sin in this life. If you use a dirty needle while shooting dope, you might get AIDS. If you rob a bank and get caught, you will go to prison. If you defraud people, you may wind up being sued. Now, we could give a million examples here, right? But so there is, in the natural factor of sin, certain natural processes that to one degree or another are set in motion. And it's like in Galatians 6, the law of sowing and reaping. You know, what you sow, you reap. What you reap, you sow. Now, we're not talking about that here. This is not what the curse that we're going to look at is about. This is not the natural consequences of sin. What we have here is a far greater reality than that. In this text, we find the reality of divine judgment. It's a very different thing. This is the Almighty God and divine judge of the universe stepping into our world, stepping into time on this earth to render a sentence. And I want to add another footnote here. As terrible as the fall in the garden was, catapulting the entire human race into a state of sin and misery, and also giving a kind of power to Satan, because he had now become the little g God of this world with a certain measure of control over these fallen people. In spite of all those horrendous effects, man's sin did not and does not in any way threaten God's sovereignty. Amen. It only changes the paradigm in which that sovereignty operates. Pre-fall, post-fall. God is still sovereign. And the immediate pronouncement of these curses that we're going to look at demonstrate God's sovereignty. He's no less sovereign in a fallen world than he was in an unfallen world. He's no less sovereign over Lucifer after his fall than he was before the fall. And the same goes for Adam and Eve. Understand, God is not and never will be a victim of Satan. And it's important for me to say that because there are people today within the ranks of professing Christianity who do everything that they can to convince us that Satan has far more power than what we understand the Bible to be clearly saying about him. That somehow God and Satan are on some kind of equal footing, and they come up with all these silly formulas of rebuking the devil and sending him to the pit and fighting Satan and the demons, and they call it spiritual warfare, and it's all thoroughly unbiblical and stupid. Every bit of it. Martin Luther said this: even the devil is God's devil. Never fall for any of that time-wasting kind of nonsense. So God gave up no sovereignty after the fall. Now it's just a different paradigm in which his sovereignty operates. And it's still the exact same way all the way up to this day. Now, in what we're going to study today, we have just two things to consider. In verse 14, we have the curse of the serpent. And in verse 15, we have the curse of Satan. It's two different things, as I'm going to show you. Notice verse 14. It says, the Lord God said to the serpent. He's speaking to the animal, the instrument of Satan. Look at it. Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. God actually curses the animal. Now, the animal doesn't have a rational mind. It has no sense of sin. It was simply used by Satan. But God curses the animal anyway, even though the animal is not a willing, rational partner in this thing. The serpent doesn't know anything about the curse or about temptation or the sin, because he can't even begin to grasp rational concepts of thinking. He's a serpent. But cursing the serpent serves a very important purpose. And I'm going to show you what that is. But first, God says here in verse 14 again, cursed are you more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. And our English translation can make it seem like God cursed all the animals there, but he didn't. You have to go back to the original Hebrew of this to get the understanding straight. And it's simply this. Out of all the animals, the serpent was selected to be cursed. That's the meaning. The wording there can kind of maybe trip you up. And it's true that all animals feel the general effects of the fall. They age, they get diseases, and in all kind of different ways, animals die just like we do. In fact, that's why Romans 8 says in very straightforward language that the whole creation groans. The universe, the whole creation feels the effect of sin and the fall. But notice again in verse 14 how God says to the serpent, because you have done this, because you have been the instrument of temptation, cursed are you more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. Now, that brings up the question, of course. Since the animal was not responsible for any of his actions, was not even rationally involved, what is the point of punishing the animal? That's a fair question. I mean, the animal doesn't even have self-consciousness. What is the point of cursing a non-reasoning, non-rational creature? And the answer is very simple. Cursing the serpent turned it into a symbol. Turned it into a constant reminder for all of human history of the degradation of Satan. And we're fixing to get into that. Remember, we know that the serpent in the garden is Satan because of Revelation 12 and Revelation 20, where he's called the serpent and the dragon. And God curses that serpent so that it becomes an all-time symbol. The snakes of the world are symbols of the divine judgment on Satan. Now you remember that Lucifer was once the anointed cherub of heaven, possibly even the director of music in heaven. But then what happened? He got the eye disease. Remember? I will 5 times. I will exalt myself above God. And then what happened? He was thrown out of heaven and he's cast down to the earth. And then not only was he angry, he still wanted to assert himself in that climb upward, to exalt himself. And what's one way he can do this? Well, he can become sovereign over man. So he leads Adam and Eve in this successful temptation. And for sure, now at this point, he imagines himself to be the sovereign. Think about it. What is he thinking? Hey, I caused this fall. And now, these two are under my control. He, as Hebrews 2 says, holds over them the fear of death all their life long. He becomes the little g God of this age, and he sees himself now as a kind of sovereign over fallen humanity. But God throws him down again in this curse. And this is symbolized by that statement in verse 14. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And every time you see a snake slithering around in your yard or anywhere, it's a sign and it's a symbol of the humiliation of Satan in this event. It's a reminder of the divine judgment upon him for tempting Adam and Eve. And think about it. Out of all the animals, are not snakes the most reviled, the most hated, probably the most feared of all the animals in the world? It's true, isn't it? And snakes don't feel the curse. He will bite you on your leg if you give him half a chance. But they do illustrate it. One commentator wrote this: the fact that this beast still stands under a curse is apparent from the peculiar revulsion that it still rouses in most people. It's true. Its peculiarly sinuous movements, its silent glide as a form of locomotion, its sinister and fascinating look, its vibrant tongue, its peculiar rearing of the head, all contribute to remind men of the peculiar history in which the serpent once shared. That's so true. And when it says in verse 14, and dust you will eat all the days of your life, it doesn't mean that dust is the food of a snake. Snakes eat insects and rodents and things like that. They don't eat dirt, but they do live in dirt, crawling around on their bellies everywhere they go. That's what this means. It's just a furtherance of this symbol of being totally defeated, just being totally brought down to the lowest level on the ground, slithering around in the dust, in the dirt. And God says, you're going to be on your belly and you're going to eat dust. And lastly, look what he says, all the days of your life. The curse will never be removed. As long as there are snakes crawling around on the ground, they'll be doomed to be perpetual symbols of the demolishing of Satan's ambitions, as we're going to see. Perpetual symbols of the defeat of the devil. Now, have you ever noticed in our society that the farther people get away from God and the deeper they go into drugs or the occult and paganism, have you noticed how they become enamored with snakes? You can see that on the internet, or if you watch documentaries about the occult and stuff like that. In the early days of the Christian church, there was a sect known as the Ophites. Ophis is the Greek word for serpent, and they worshiped the devil. And the symbol of that snake, of that sect, was a snake. Today, there's a group up in the mountains of Syria called the Yazidi, and they worship the devil. And the emblem of their religion is the snake. So that is the perversion and wickedness of calling good what God himself has cursed. And there have been many cults and many sects down through history that have used the snake as their symbol. And this is just a curse on the natural serpent at this point. Look next in verse 15. We move now from the natural serpent to the supernatural Satan. Look at verse 15. God says, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Now, there is so much to say about this verse that for sure I don't have time to go through all of it today. This is a major verse in the Bible. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a little preview, and then we're going to move on to our celebration of the Lord's Supper. First of all, here you have God speaking not to the serpent, but now straight to Satan himself. Not to the natural serpent, but to the supernatural spirit. And I want you to notice that in this encounter, Satan does not speak. He had a lot to say back in the garden, right? With Eve, but he has nothing to say here. Because here, God is the sovereign. Here, God alone speaks. And nobody speaks when God is speaking unless he wants them to. So the devil is silent here. Satan's rebellion failed in heaven, and now it's failing on earth. And he is now subject to God's judgment. But let's think about this for just a minute from Satan's perspective. He may have been thinking, well, I failed to a degree, but I have had some success. I mean, I was thrown out of heaven, but I did take a third of the angels with me. So I do have sort of a kingdom down here with them. And I was successful in capturing Adam and Eve. I mean, from his perspective, hey, I made a massive dent in this divine purpose of God. God went through all this amazing effort to create this universe and stars and planets and galaxies and placed a woman and a man on the earth for his glory, and I gained their devotion. And that is essentially what happened, right? Adam and Eve doubted God and questioned God, and they believed Satan. Who knows? He may have thought, look, I've won the full devotion of humanity, and now with a third of the angels, they will help me to overthrow God. I mean, Adam and Eve were perfect, and they fell so easily from my trap. It'll be no problem gaining control of all their offspring, so I got demons and men. I can go to war. Who knows what he was thinking? If he did think that, I'm here to tell you that thought didn't last long, because God immediately says there in verse 15, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Sorry, Satan. I'm in charge here, God says. It's my plan, and I make all the rules. Now, this word enmity, it means conflict, hostility, hatred, the state of being an enemy. Don't get carried away with your successes here, Satan. God is saying, because I'm cursing you by making you an enemy of the woman and an enemy of the seed of the woman, and there will be one who will come one day and he will crush your head. If Satan was thinking that he had pulled off some kind of coup, and now he had total control over the man and the woman, he was deceiving himself. God says, I will put enmity, conflict, hostility, hatred, and you will not rule easily in your little g God role down there on planet Earth. You will not rule totally and successfully. You will not have complete control of the earth. I will bring humanity into conflict with you. Because think about this. There was already enmity in the world at this point. But the enmity at this point was between God and who? God and man. There wasn't at this point any enmity between man and Satan. Adam and Eve had followed Satan, right? They fell for his trap. There was no hostility between them. After they sinned, you don't find them hiding in the garden from the serpent, do you? You find them hiding in the garden from God, because now there was enmity there because of their sin. Now Satan could see that or sense that. And he's thinking, now there's hostility between them and God. And look, they're running from God. They're hiding from God. This has never happened before. They don't see God as their friend anymore. They see God as their enemy. And they see me as their friend. And God immediately steps in here and says, hold on, Slewfoot. Not so fast. I'm going to put enmity between you and that woman. You're not going to have Eve, and you're not going to have total sovereignty over her seed. And in fact, one of them is going to come and crush your head. Now, what all that right there means is going to have to wait till next week. So you have to come back. But let me close by asking you this. Who was it that came to crush the serpent's head? Our King. King Jesus. And that blow did come at the cross. God says, Satan, you may have thought all of humanity was going to be your enemy, but you're wrong. Man's going to be your enemy. And I'm going to provide a way to bring man back to be my friend. So here we have already in Genesis 3, the first flicker, the first glimmer of the gospel. And it is this gospel that we've come to celebrate and commemorate and pronounce today in the observance of the Lord's Supper. So let's begin by turning in our Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 27 through 30. We read this at every Lord's Supper because we want to get our minds right about what we're doing here. Now, as you know, our table is open to every person who has repented of their sins and placed their saving faith and trust in Jesus Christ alone for their salvation, and who have been baptized in an announcement to the world that they have been saved. All true Bible-believing Christians are open to come to our table. But as we do, we want to stop and pause and read this warning that Paul gave to the church in Corinth. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself if he does not judge the body rightly. For this reason many among you are weak and sick, and a number sleep. And they weren't just taking a nap. It means they were dead. They died. There's a particular judgment for not coming to the Lord's table in the correct way. I don't have time to go through all that. You know that story. But what this says to us is that, again, just like I said in the beginning of our service about church, the Lord's Supper is a very special moment. This is a group of His adopted by grace family coming together in unity to observe what He commanded us to do this in remembrance of Him, in remembrance of who He is, a remembrance of what He has done on Calvary's tree, a remembrance that He rose on the third day in fulfillment of the Scriptures, a remembrance that He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of power of God the Father, and that He rules and He reigns, and that one day He's coming again in glory to judge the living and the dead, to remember all about who Christ is and what He has done and what He is going to do. Because no matter how bad things get in our world and our society, we win in the end. Just read it all the way through the end of the book. We win. We're on the winning side. Doesn't matter how bad it gets. As bad as it can get is we die and then we go to glory. That's the worst thing, right? The worst thing is the best thing that happens for us. And so until that happens, we come together as the church to proclaim the gospel, to proclaim Christ in all of His marvelous attributes, all of his marvelous work, his person and his work in the Lord's Supper. And when we do that, we want to take a pause. We want to examine ourselves. We want to think about our week. We want to think about our battle this past week with the world, the flesh, and the devil. We want to go to him. We know all of our sins are forgiven, past, present, and future. Up here judicially, but positionally, while we're down here still in responsibility land, we're still battling flesh, sinning. So we say, hey, Lord, forgive me. Forgive me for my failures. Help me to get in a right spirit and a right mind to observe your commandments. So let's do that. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes. We'll take a moment to do that.